Good evening, and on behalf of the Washington, D.C. Lawyer Chapter of the American Constitution Society, I would like to welcome you to tonight's event, ACS DC's Sovereignty and Status Series, Tribal Nations Today. I'd like to first thank our panelist and moderator for taking the time this evening to speak to us. I'm very much looking forward to this, and I'm sure all of the audience is as well. I would like to also thank the Austin, Texas Lawyer Chapter and the Los Angeles Lawyer Chapter of the American Constitution Society for co-sponsoring. And what I believe maybe for the first time for our chapter, at least, I am very excited to announce that the Native American Bar Association of Washington, D.C. is also co-sponsoring this event. While it may be the first time that we are co-sponsoring an event together, I hope it won't be the last. I look forward to many more great programs. I should let everyone know that in addition to tonight's great program, our chapter does regular programming, and we have another great program coming up next week on March 31st. We are proud to sponsor an event with the Judicial Nomination Commission at sorry, I should have the time pulled up. I believe it's 6:30 to 8 p.m. Registration for that is available on the ACS website. It should be an incredible event. With that, I am going to turn it over to my esteemed law school classmate and the moderator for tonight, Josh Claus.
Thank you, Austin, and thank you to the American Constitution Society for putting this important conversation together, and the panelists that have agreed to join us, and everyone that's listening in and watching. I'm really excited for this conversation tonight. My name's Josh Claus. I'm a citizen of the Mohawk Nation, enrolled up at Six Nations of the Grand River Territory. I'm the principal at Claus Law. It's a boutique law firm in Washington, D.C., where we exclusively focus on helping tribal nations, tribal organizations, and tribal enterprises with legal and policy solutions. The way I've structured this conversation may be a little bit different. I wanted to bring in some viewpoints to see all the different realities and how tribal sovereignty is exercised in the challenges that tribal nations and organizations run into when dealing with the federal government and state governments. So for that, I have a panelist who is a tribal leader, who's going to bring a very unique perspective, a panelist who is an in-house counsel, and then a law professor. And I think kind of between that, we'll be able to field everybody's questions and have kind of a robust discussion. And so I'm going to introduce our panelists. I'm going to turn it over for a few minutes for them to offer some remarks. And then I'm going to start off with a few questions. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A box, and I will direct those to the panelists as the conversation evolves. Our first panelist, and again, I'm going to go through and introduce everyone and then turn it over to the panelist, just for logistics, I guess, is Chairman Forsman from the Suquamish Tribe. Chairman Forsman, the Squamish Tribe is located in Washington State on the shores of the Puget Sound. He's the former vice chair of the Advisory Council of Historic Preservation, and is coming off a weekend where he was just reelected as tribal chairman. So he's excited for his next tour of duty, or 3 years on his sentence. I don't know how it goes, but we also have Natasha Singh, who's the general counsel of Tanana Chiefs Conference up in Alaska. She's a member of Stevens Village. She's a graduate of the University of Washington Law School and is just doing a ton of amazing things up in Alaska. And she's going to be able to provide a really unique perspective of how tribal sovereignty plays out in Alaska and how it's different from the lower 48. And then last but not least, this is obviously a University of Michigan heavy panel, also in a lot of University of Michigan. Professor, I'm sorry, I'm in the field at a client's office, and they have energy saving lights, which are to my detriment at the moment. But Professor Matt Fletcher, he's a member of the Grand Traverse Band of Ottawa and Chippewa Indians from Michigan. He's currently professor at Michigan State College of Law and the director of the Indigenous Law and Policy Center. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Chairman Forsman first for some remarks, then to Natasha, and then to Professor Fletcher. And then when Professor Fletcher's done, then I'll start posing some questions. So Chairman Forsman, the floor is yours.
I'm trying to share my screen, so I'm going to try that again. It might work again. Let's see. Is it working? Not yet?
Yes, it's working.
Okay. So I'm just going to go ahead and use my PowerPoint, and thank you for the opportunity to present. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the Suquamish Tribe and how we approach sovereignty. And I'm a historian archaeologist by training. So I probably have a little bit of more of a historic perspective, but as the three lawyers on here know, I think everything relates to our history, so and our culture. So anyway, I was on council for 15 years. I've been chairman now for 16, and I'm just really happy to be here to talk a little bit about the Suquamish tribe. We're a marine tribe, primarily reliant on salmon and shellfish for our way of life, and continue to do that today. We didn't have a major river, so we didn't have salmon coming to our front door, so we had to go far and wide to travel by canoe to different places to gather our food. For right around treaty time, we had over 160 canoes counted on our reservation, so we were very, very dependent on water transportation. And so the main thing was to gather enough food for the winter residency. So we would gather and store as much food as we could. And then that's when a lot of our ceremonial activities would occur. And then we'd head out in the spring and start all over again with the renewal. And a lot of our ceremonies were thanking the Creator for the bounty of food that we would receive every year and not taking it for granted. One of the things that, of course, happened after first contact, our first contact was in 1792 with the British Navy. Captain Vancouver came out to Puget Sound, but about 60 years after that, jumping ahead, I mean, this is not Captain Vancouver. This is Isaac Stevens, who did a lot of treaty negotiations throughout the West. As the European nations, the world community didn't acknowledge conquest as a means to acquiring Aboriginal lands. So they had a concept of Aboriginal title, and that required a treaty-making process. So President Pierce appointed Isaac Stevens, and he was a U.S. Army West Point graduate, and he had 3 jobs. He was governor of the Washington Territory, which is now Washington and Oregon. He was commander of the Railroad Survey, and he was the superintendent of Indian Affairs. So he was a true multitasker, and got out here, and he really wanted to get all these treaties signed out here out west. He did them in Montana, Oregon, Washington, at least Montana and Washington. I don't know for sure about Oregon, but anyway, that's a detail. But they became known as the Stevens Treaties, and he really wanted to get back to DC and run for president, but he was killed in the Civil War, so that didn't happen. But did have a big impact on our tribes out here out west. So the Point Elliott treaties, which we signed, allowed us to retain our off-reservation hunting and fishing rights. Were guaranteed as long as we moved to the reservations and gave up our land. And so Stevens defended this as a way of us being able to feed ourselves and keep their costs down. And also there were other parts of the treaty, including payments for our land, health care, education, medical care. All those things were indicated to be part of the treaty as well, in exchange for us giving up our Aboriginal title. It also established reservations, and ours is the Port Madison Indian Reservation, where we live today. Another story about land, but a lot of our land on the reservation has been lost because of later land sales and other assimilation policies that maybe would be a talk for another time. But ultimately, we live on a checkerboard reservation, and we're outnumbered about 11 to 1 here, non-tribal to tribal people. So we continue to have our struggles, but also opportunities in that respect. Tribal leadership, this is Chief Seattle, and he was, of course, the namesake of the city, and signed the treaty for us. And after the treaty was signed, he said these words, and I think that it's important that we mentioned that he says, all the Indians have the same good feeling towards you, and we'll send it on paper to the Great Father. He was talking about the treaty, and this was a legal contract. So he was very aware that this was a legal contract, and he needed to go back to the president and the Congress. Another leader at the who's the lead, the ancestor of the Tulalip tribe, says, "We want everything as you have said, the doctor and all," which meant I want the doctor, I want the fishing rights retained, I want a reservation, I want the education, all the things you said, such as the feeling of the Indians. God makes them good towards the Americans, because the British were still around too. So there was very much a keen idea of the fact that we're throwing in with the Americans, because they had been working with the British Hudson's Bay Company for a long time. So the treaty process concludes. Seattle presented Stevens with a white flag. He says, "Now we're making this agreement. We will never change our minds. But since you have been to see us, we'll always be the same," Chief Seattle says. "Now send this paper of our hearts to the great chief." That's all I have to say. He was very emphatic. Congress ratified our treaty in 1859. This made the Treaty of Point Elliott the supreme law of the land, as referenced in Article 6, Clause 2 of the United States Constitution. All treaties made or which shall be made under the authority of the United States shall be the supreme law of the land. Pretty clear language. So the treaty legacy, is over time, there's been a lot that's happened since then. Two big things are the Bolt decision and the Rafiti decision. The Bolt decision regarded salmon. So the tribe sued, saying that the state of Washington wasn't recognizing the treaty right to fish. This turned out to become a decision that awarded and recognized the tribe's right to half the harvestable salmon in Washington state in 1974. This was a big deal. Not only did it alter the whole fishing industry in Washington, but it also recognized the tribes as co-managers of the fishery. So they're on equal level with the state, federal, and even the international community like Canada in managing the fish, managing salmon harvest throughout the Puget Sound and beyond. And also the Rafiti decision did the same for shellfish. So crab and gooey duck and these other big species that are important to our economy are part of that as well. So the world's changed in a lot of ways, and we speak the language of Lushootseed, which is our language, and we're trying to restore that. And so the treaty provides us economic opportunities, but also cultural opportunities. And so the harvest of our marine resources, protection of our treaty resources, all those things are so important to us spiritually, culturally, and economically. So as we move forward, we want to continue to try to follow the good red road, where we get on to do our ceremonies and thank the Creator for everything we have. So with that, I'd like to thank you, and I will turn it back to Josh.
Thank you, Chairman. And we'll turn it right over to Natasha to share some introductory remarks, talk a little bit about her work, Tanana Chiefs Conference, and just sovereignty in Alaska, and to get going. So thank you, Natasha.
Hi, good afternoon, good evening to those of you on the East Coast. So I am speaking from Fairbanks, Alaska. It's right in the middle of Alaska. I represent, as General Counsel to Tanana Chiefs Conference, 37 federally recognized tribes. And we are not treaty tribes. In fact, we don't have any reservation lands in Alaska outside of a small community of Metlakatla in the southeast. So our relationship and our sovereignty is expressed quite differently than what was just described by Chairman Leonard. But it is good to start off that way, just to see the different ways tribes grab hold of governance tools. And in Alaska, tribes have been stripped so much of those governance tools. Specifically in our land claims in 1971, our Aboriginal title was taken, and our governing authority as tribes over our traditional territories were taken without even mentioning that tribes even exist. So whereas Alaska Native people living in rural Alaska depend on the lands and waters for their daily meals. We're still a very much hunting and fishing dependent communities. We have no actual authority over our lands and waters. We have no authority to manage our natural resources. And this has caused great harm to our people. And this has resulted, along with colonization, the other aspects of colonization, but has really resulted in a public safety crisis. And because we have no jurisdiction over our lands, our tribal leaders are told they have no actual authority to improve the criminal activity in their communities. And then for decades, the state of Alaska really denied the existence of tribes in Alaska and really told the tribes, you have no power to do anything. Many of our tribal leaders, though, continued their God-given duty to protect their tribal citizens, and eventually our tribes built up case law, which has forced the state and the federal governments to recognize tribes. And these small morsels of governance tools we have built up over time. And our tribes have tribal courts where they initiate child protection proceedings, and that's a large expression of our tribal sovereignty in Alaska, is protecting our children. Another strong expression of self-determination is our healthcare, and many of you might have seen some of the national news where the Alaska Tribal Health System is actually leading the way in vaccine distribution, and that's because of specifically our tribes in Alaska. And while basically our tribes are just carrying out the duties of the federal government to provide health care, all of the Alaska tribes have entered into one single legal agreement with the Indian Health Service, and we're doing their work to implement health care for our tribal people. And we've done it extremely well, and that's why we're leading the nation in vaccine distribution. But what tribal sovereignty means to tribes in Alaska, because we have been, so much has been taken for us, we really, we know when it's taken from you, you really know what it is. What is tribal sovereignty? It's your governance tools. It's the necessary governance tools to advance the well-being of your community and tribal citizens. So my job as general counsel is to build up those tools and help our tribes implement them. Thank you.
And I'll turn it over to Professor Fletcher. And before I turn it over, though, I should mention I forgot to share that Professor Fletcher runs Turtle Talk blog, which is all sorts of great resources on cases that are impacting Indian country. And so if you Google Turtle Talk, it'll be a great resource for anyone that's interested. And with that, I'll turn it over for Professor Fletcher to share some of his views and insights.
Great. I'm going to share my screen too, just briefly. Hope you can see it. This is the law professor's view of what tribal sovereignty is. I wanted to show you something that was published by the Phoenix area office of the Bureau of Indian Affairs in the 1970s, after the Indian Civil Rights Act was enacted, and after Santa Clara Pueblo, when the Supreme Court said that cases like membership issues have to be resolved by the tribes. And the BIA in Phoenix thought it was important to write a 100-page book explaining to tribes what government means, what equal protection and due process is. And at the highlight of that, I thought, the low light perhaps was this chart of hierarchies of law. If you look, this is very much how the federal government then and probably now thinks of where Indian law situates itself, where the law of Indian tribes situates itself, way down at the bottom, underneath the Constitution. To give them some credit, states are not in here, so they're sort of set aside. But tribes, you can see the arrows pointing down. Tribes are looking up at the United States government, at the United States Constitution, at US Congress, et cetera, et cetera. They just wanted to remind, at least the Phoenix area, if anybody from the Phoenix area even read this thing, I don't even know, that where Indian tribes really sit. And that's what sovereignty is to me. It's a really weird notion that doesn't fit particularly well with, I would say, the vast majority of Indian tribes in the United States. I'm going to stop my sharing just for a moment. The notion of sovereignty is something that is my understanding, the very prescient tribal advocates, Indian advocates of the 1960s and 70s started talking to people who were in position that Chairman Forsman is in now. When they went to DC, when they negotiated with the states and local governments, with anybody, talk about sovereignty. It was a mantra. Vine Deloria talked about sovereignty. Kirk Kickenberg talked about sovereignty. Wilson Pipestem talked about sovereignty. You heard it over and over again until it became this thing that Indian tribes treat as sort of a legal and political religion, not an actual religion, and not a cultural religion. It looks like Josh got cut off again from the tribal government. So sorry to hear that. You got to pay the bill. Those little squirrels that are riding the bicycle in the basement are getting tired. They need to be fed some grain or something. All right, moving on. So this is all really interesting to me, this history, and I wish somebody would write a book, this kind of advocacy. And you have the Indian Civil Rights Act, you have Santa Clara Pueblo versus Martinez, and you have the rise of Indian self-determination, all of which is happening in the 60s and 70s. And tribes really do exercise sovereignty in a very meaningful way. And the US Constitution acknowledges that tribes are sovereign entities right alongside states and foreign nations. What the scope of that is to be negotiated, and Chairman Forsman talked a little bit about how Suquamish and a lot of the tribes in the Pacific Northwest negotiated that sovereignty with the United States. But it's a weird thing, and it's caused an enormous amount of trouble, as well as being quite possibly the thing that saved Indian people in the last half century. It's kind of like the analog is when Homer Simpson says that beer is the cause of and solution to all life's problems. I think with Indian country, you could say sovereignty is the cause of and solution to all of tribes' problems. What is sovereignty? Sovereignty, the theory of sovereignty is that there's this big one thing or person who is so powerful, so indisputably in power over everyone else that they can't be challenged. When we talk about tribal sovereign immunity sometimes, or federal or state sovereign immunity, some of the Supreme Court justices have referred to sovereign immunity as an expression of the phrase, the king can do no wrong. You can't sue the king is the sovereign. We don't have a king in the United States. So some Supreme Court justices, other federal and tribal judges too, think sovereign immunity is anathema, is wrong because we don't have a king. That every governmental entity should be accountable to even the smallest citizen of the nation in which they are located. That should be that's a question of liberal democracy, of democratic accountability. Tribes have bought into the notion that the king can do no wrong. Tribes assert sovereign immunity in cases every single day, in negotiations with business partners, with state and local governments every single day. They also assert sovereign immunity to their own citizens who have a legitimate argument in some cases, citizens who slip and fall at the tribal casino, citizens who have been barred from bringing a civil rights claim against the tribe for denial of membership or disenrollment, or being fired from the tribal casino because they asserted a right to a religious accommodation or something. Not always. Tribes are actually very good. The tribal elected officials are very accountable in a way that state and federal officials are not to their citizens. But there still is this. There are times you read about it in the paper. You can read about it on Turtle Talk when a tribe is asserting its sovereignty in a way that is antithetical to what that we understand to be good governance. And that just gives us an entree into thinking about what it is that tribes could do that is an expression of culturally appropriate governance. And I don't know what the answer is to that for really any tribe. I have ideas about some of the Anishinaabe communities here in Michigan, my own in particular, Grand Traverse Band. I think that my understanding is our traditional governance model was rooted in 7 clans and the teachings associated with those clans and the rule of the circle and the rule of the 7 grandfather or grandmother teachings, and the rule of Manoba Madzawin, that we are all related, and relational accountability, and now when Daywin of our communities in which every decision we made had impacts on each other. There was no hierarchy like the screen I showed you before. There was a circle. There was equality and respect and humility. And we have 7 clans. We have 7 council members, but our council members, and not to pick on them, but this is the structure that we have chosen for ourselves, live on a structure of hierarchy, and they're at the top of that hierarchy. And they're the ones asserting the right of a tribal community to sovereignty, which can be an enormously beneficial thing to all around us. At the same time, there is definitely a dark side. And I like thinking and talking about, as a professor, these culturally appropriate ideas, these Anishinaabe or indigenous political philosophies. So how's that for your esoteric academic speak?
I think you definitely checked the box. Natasha's excited. We'll keep Natasha muted because I don't want to get her too far off the rails. But no, I definitely appreciate it. I think, when you talk about tribal sovereignty, in what I do working in Washington, DC, there's a lot of interactions, and I think we're all committed, and there goes my light again, I apologize, to good governance, at the state, federal, and tribal level. And I don't think, accountability is good everywhere. And it's best when that accountability comes from within the community and not from the outside, looking down, like in your chart of the federal government and the BIA coming down and in. And I think one of the challenges in DC is watching folks that want to be advocates and allies until a tribe does something they don't like. Everyone is very excited and accommodating for things that fit in the box that they like, and when things move outside of that box, all of a sudden, federal and state and a lot of advocacy groups and interest groups all of a sudden, like, whoa, we don't like what the tribes are doing now because it competes with what our views should be. So that's always kind of an interesting dynamic that I think we all have to deal with. In talking about those interactions, maybe we're starting to get a bunch of questions in, but I did want to pose one question. With the interactions, I mean, I think we did a good overview of kind of where things are, but in your areas, where do you see the tribes interacting with the state, local governments, state, local, and federal government? How are those interactions? How can they be better? What do people need to understand? Because we do have attorneys on here from state, local, and federal governments, and how can we make that relationship better? And nobody wants to take that one. Okay.
I'm happy to talk, but I'm waiting for the others. I'm trying to play by the rules and go in order.
Jump in. That was part of my PowerPoint that I didn't jump on, was government to government concept, and I meant to, but I was trying to hurry through, so it didn't take too much time. But anyway, that's the key part of the treaty process, was that the United States agreed to, and this is something that's been adjudicated, to reserve these rights, not give us these rights, but reserve them and protect them. So we don't rely, but we ask other governments to do the same. So we ask state and local governments to protect salmon runs, protect habitat, and also, if they're involved in education, to respect the fact that the federal government also promised in education, and also as far as medical services and health services, the same thing. So we really can, rely on local governments, and oftentimes have to sometimes pursue litigation to force them to work with us, or to what's the word for it here? To force them to agree with that legal theory and legal fact that they are to move forward with that. So we do a lot of that here in Suquamish. We work with our county commissioners. We work with our state governor, state legislature. We're pretty good shape here in Washington compared to other states, where our state tribal affairs are really pretty positive, and comply was the word I was looking for. And so we have an annual centennial accord with the governor, where we kind of bring out our issues and talk about those with the governor's office. And then we have a pretty active relationship with our state legislature, et cetera, et cetera. So this continues and permeates a lot of what we do, let alone what we do with the federal government, which we're underwater right now with trying to consult with the new Biden administration. So I'll just leave it at that for now, and I know more can pile on.
So I think it's my turn. So in the state of Alaska, like I said in the beginning, they really denied the existence of tribal governments for decades. So a lot of our Alaska legislature, they don't even know, some of them don't even know that tribes exist, which is quite bizarre, since Alaska Natives make up 20% of the population, and we have 231 tribes in Alaska. We're going and testifying now via Zoom constantly to the legislator, giving them the basics, the basics on what's a tribe, basically Alaska history, because they weren't properly taught that in their state schools. So I think ground level is tribes exist in our country. Their existence is stemmed from the US Constitution, but before the Constitution, we had our traditional governments that were rooted in a strong religions. And in Alaska, these were covenants between our tribal members, the land, the waters, and the animals. And these covenants then dictated how we would treat each other in these different realms. And we believe currently our situation stems from not properly addressing those covenants. And I think that's what Professor Fletcher maybe was kind of getting at, is that as tribes express their sovereignty, also it's a determining what your government is a huge expression of that. So not only your relationships between the state and the federal government are important, but your relationships with other tribes, neighboring tribes, and also your relationships with your traditional territories, your traditional waters, and your animal relations. So yeah, the basics in Alaska we're teaching is tribes exist and we have a lot of power. And when we don't have that power and authority, we will create those. For instance, in the interior, we have the Yukon River Intertribal Fish Commission. We weren't given authority by the federal or state government to create this fish commission. The tribes gave the authority to each other. We're the ones who depend on the resource, the salmon on the Yukon River. And if we get together and unify with one voice, we know we can have an impact on the management that the state legally manages, but we're unifying together, and we are going to press upon the state managers to listen to our voice, because it's so strong when it's unified. Thank you.
That's amazing. I would like to compare and contrast a little bit Michigan and Washington with Alaska, where, you know, again, as Natasha said, there's no treaty rights there that are acknowledged. And so there's not that history of litigation and ultimately resolution of treaty rights, which forced, starting in the 70s and 80s, the tribes and the states and the feds to talk to each other. And it's an ongoing relationship. It's very, very important, but it's one, relatively speaking, between equals, arm's length transactions and or bargaining. And so you just don't see that in the same way in Alaska, is my sense, which is incredibly detrimental to the governance of the entire state in so many different ways. So the thing about sovereignty with Indian tribes that is critically important, a big part of it, is that nobody will talk to tribes unless there's an acknowledgement of that sovereignty. And here in Michigan, you know, it's not a whole lot different than anywhere else. Even Alaska, state legislators really don't know anything about tribes. Government officials are always going in and out of government. We have term limits in the legislature and the governor's office. Every couple of years, sometimes every few months, the tribes are when they talk to the state, they are talking to totally different people. And it's always an educational process. There's somewhat more stability with dealing with the feds, but as a practical matter, right now, for example, it's restarting old relationships with people in the federal government or talking to brand new people in the federal government. And it's an ongoing complex thing, but that the reason that these things exist is because of the sovereignty. And that's really important, but it does come with consequences, right? So when we are negotiating with the state of Michigan, say over the Line 5 that runs underneath the Straits of Mackinac, you know, over the past few years, since there's been a governor in office who's willing to listen and talk to tribes and take their issues seriously, the amount of pressure that she's received from interests all over the place, and it's bipartisan interests to really reject the tribe's positions, has a lot to do with the fact that it's a tribe asserting sovereignty. It has a lot to do with the fact that it's a tribe asserting sovereignty. Everyone thinks of a sovereign as its own personal interest. And, you know, a state of Michigan is really interested in dealing with the state of Wisconsin, so we can grab rents from the state of Wisconsin. We can grab our interests. We're all self-centered. We're all competitive. And push comes to shove, we can be violent. And tribes that's not the political theory of tribes, right? I mentioned Inawindewin, which is critically important. And I think all indigenous peoples in the US have some analog to Inawindewin, which is effectively the 7 generations. It's all our relations. It literally means something like relational accountability, but that's the many times, not always, but many times tribes are projecting this political philosophy into a debate, which is really about self-interested entities, governments, individuals, private businesses, asserting a very selfish and zero-sum view of the world. And I like to say, when I talk about the environment, which is not a lot, I don't really teach natural resources environment. That's more my wife, Winona Singles bailiwick, who incidentally has been working for the governor of Michigan for the past few years until recently. You know, when the tribes do something, when we assert treaty rights, yeah, there's some selfish element to that, but our treaty rights are actually here to protect you. The reason that treaty rights became a thing in the U.S. Supreme Court in 1908 in U.S. v. Winans is because there were no federal laws that protected fish, that conserved fish, regulated any hunting and fishing. Nothing in the state of Washington was doing that. There were no laws to prevent the Winans brothers in that case from literally exterminating the entire species of fish on that river, which is what they were about to do. The only thing that stood in the way between that and the extermination of fish was treaty rights. And that's really important to remember. That's what the treaty rights ultimately are about, at least when it comes to natural resources and conservation.
That's a great point. And a next question that we have coming from folks that are listening in is tribal sovereignty more fragile than state sovereignty because tribal sovereignty falls under the plenary powers of Congress and state sovereignty is enshrined in the Constitution? If so, does the fear of congressional abrogation of tribal sovereignty chill the exercise of tribal sovereignty in commercial context? So I'll turn that to Chairman Forsman first.
Okay, could you characterize that question one more time?
I know that was a lot of reading. I'm sorry.
Is it about
So it
abrogation of
basically,
treaties?
so is tribal sovereignty more fragile than state sovereignty because Congress has plenary authority over tribes? So in states their sovereignty is enshrined in the Constitution.
Right. I think that yes, from a practical matter, but from a political perspective, we've worked really hard. This is how I got involved with congressional politics, was when I learned in college that, oh, the Congress can abrogate our treaty? Boy, I better find out who my congressman is, And so I got involved with the campaign right away, and I've been engaged ever since. I have always had an interest in politics, but I really got interested then. And, so I remember the tribes have gotten very engaged in our congressional and, elections and in meeting with Congress on both sides of the aisle, primarily for this purpose. Not only is it that's probably the most important issue, but also working on the budget and how bills are passed, and also changing policy. And so there's been one issue I'll just bring up that we're well known in Indian country is the Oliphant Decision. And that decision regarded police jurisdiction. Our police way back in the 70s arrested a drunk driver and reckless driver and jailed him and tried to bring him to tribal court. Long story short, went to the Supreme Court and we lost. So we lost criminal jurisdiction over non-Indians, and we've been scratching to get that reinstated ever since. And it's been mainly through Congress passing bills regarding violence against women, and actually got us tribes the ability to prosecute non-Indian offenders in our tribal courts. It's very complicated, but it's slowly coming back. And Senator Murkowski, thank you, actually said during an NCI meeting, we need to overturn Oliphant. And it was like, wow, we're making progress. So these are all things that can happen through those political connections. So I would say yes, but a lot stronger now than when I got involved in that first congressional election back in the 80s.
So I'm up, I guess, what commercial context for Alaska tribes? Honestly, we don't have land, so our ability to really engage in economic development is so limited in Alaska, and it's really unfortunate. So in Alaska, Congress in 1971 separated the tribes from their traditional territories and gave our territories to for-profit corporations that are owned by individual Alaska Native shareholders, but have no governing duties or authority or obligations. So we have these for-profit entities owned by Alaska Natives that own our land, and the tribes have all the responsibilities to provide government, public safety, education, healthcare, but they have no economic base to do that. So we rely solely on the federal government, which is minimal. Our tribes are what the Bureau of Indian Affairs refers to as small and needy. And so our tribes get minimal funding to do all this. So does tribal sovereignty chill the exercise of in the commercial context? We don't really see that, I guess, because we carry out Indian Health Service contracts, we're heavily involved in the development of our healthcare. And when we were going out to bond Tanana Chiefs Conference, we're going out to all these bond investors, telling them how great we are at TCC, how great we manage our healthcare dollars, and one of the, and we were trying to explain to them what tribes are, because most people in America just don't understand we're the other sovereign and what the relationship is with the federal government and our tribes. And we said, oh, well, there's a federal trust relationship. And the bond investor is like, federal trust relationship? Doesn't the federal government just treat tribes really bad? Like, that's what we're taught. I'm like, yeah, basically that's the truth. So, but they invested in our bonds. So I didn't quite chill that, but there's always
answer.
a waiver of tribal sovereign immunity in those contract agreements.
So I would like to definitely address the first part of that. I kind of have a bit of a quirky view on the powers of Congress and the United States, this plenary power. I think the fact that the United States can restrict what tribes do means that tribes have to earn their sovereignty. So the reason that tribes are been able to engage over the past 40 odd years after Oliphant, for example, with Congress and the Department of Justice, because they're the biggest reason there's no Oliphant fix right now, is because tribes are actually governing better than the jurisdictions around them in a lot of places. That's the story, one of the stories and themes of the McGirt versus Oklahoma decision, which is state of Oklahoma is effectively a failed state. There are large swaths of Oklahoma that are completely ruined and destroyed by the oil and gas industry. There's no regulation whatsoever from the state of Oklahoma. Their legislature, their government is bought and paid for by natural resource extraction. And so they pollute the hell out of Oklahoma. They don't have good schools. They don't have good hospitals. And Muskogee Creek Nation and the other 5 tribes and some other tribes in Oklahoma with resources are effectively stepping in for the state of Oklahoma and some of the local governments and doing the job that those governments refuse to do. And that's the real interesting story of being under the thumb of the threat of the federal government, is that you have to earn your sovereignty. Tribes are actually doing better governance in a lot of places around the country. The natural resource conservation, environmental protection in the Great Lakes and the Puget Sound region and other places in the country, all of that is driven by the politics of tribal government. Whether it seems like it or not, it totally is. And that's a reality. And that's something we don't give enough credit to tribes for doing. Tribes don't do enough shameless self-promotion. I think that's a part of it. But that's when you have limited sovereignty and you exercise what powers you have, that consortium that Natasha talked about earlier of the tribes, and I think it was the Yukon River area, that's what tribes do all over the country. We earn our sovereignty. And state governments, the sovereignty was given to them by the Constitution. And many of them don't acknowledge what it means to govern, because they never had to earn that moment where they learned how to govern. Lots of states around the US are like that. And so I would say that it's kind of a good thing. That said, state immunity, state powers are just as subject to being overridden by Congress as tribal powers are, maybe even more so. Think of Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, which allows Congress the power to impose all sorts of obligations on states so that they provide equal protection of the law to all persons within their jurisdictions. That's the section of the Constitution that people don't pay much attention to, and gives the federal government enormous power over states that they sometimes exercise it at times, not always. I think they do more so with states. Congress does more restriction of state sovereignty than they do at this point of tribal sovereignty. Having those treaties is really important. Now, this doesn't help Alaska and California so much, but pretty much everywhere else, tribes have treaties. And there's a reason, Mr. Chairman, why in the 70s and 80s, when Congress could have abrogated treaty rights in the Pacific Northwest and in the Great Lakes, it's because when you terminate those rights, you're terminating a property interest. And under the Fifth Amendment, that's a taking of a property right. And if you can quantify how much money tribal members make on fishing in a given year and multiply that by how long the treaty is supposed to last, that's $100,000 times infinity. Congress could never pay in realistic terms for the termination of Indian treaty rights.
That's a great point. And one of the things, kind of tailing off from one of the things Professor Fletcher said, I think when we talk about plenary authority over tribal nations, the diversity in Indian country is massive. There are, just in federally recognized tribes, there's 574, and that diversity in terms of culture, language, interest, how they support their governments, it's massive. And when Congress comes through and decides that they're going to pass a law based on a situation for some, tribe, they don't take a step back and say, how is this going to impact tribes in Alaska? How is this going to impact tribes in the Great Lakes or in the Southwest? And so they just legislate at all of Indian country in one broad stroke. And that can create, I guess, a lot of work for lawyers and a lot of problems on the ground in tribes. So, it's a really big challenge to tackle that. And, I think looking over at our questions, and I apologize as I look at this. When exercising your tribe's sovereignty or advising tribes that you work with on how to exercise their sovereignty, how do you balance pushing the exercise of that sovereignty to the extent it should minimize the risk of creating more negative case law or spurring other negative backlash? So I guess the question is, how do you make those decisions on your sovereignty in a way that may not create that bad case law? How do you approach it? What is your tolerance for risk? And I say that with the context of knowing that I just said any bad case law impacts us all. So Chairman Forsman, I'll turn it to you for that one.
That becomes part of your discussions all the time when you're making decisions on going to sue on an action that might be detrimental, and you need good facts, and you need a good understanding of what your legal rights are. So, for example, with us and a lot of these natural resources claims that we make or defenses that we make, where maybe they're going to build a big dock out into the water, and there's a permit that has to go through the Corps of Engineers, and that could impact our fishing activity and also impact the fishing runs and their health. We have to look very closely at the previous case law, and then what are the facts in that particular case before we enter into a legal process for that. So we often will try to find some middle ground if possible, but oftentimes it's just not a project that's just not tolerable. So we have to say, hey, you know what, we're asking the federal government, who's our trustee, to protect our fisheries as they promised in the treaty, and not issue the permit for that particular in-water project. And we've got pretty good case law up here on that. But there was the more recent one with the culverts case, where the tribe sued the state on all the culverts that they have built that block fish passage, block salmon from going up and spawning. And there was a lot of debate on whether we should go to the Supreme Court on that one, and whether we could go all the way. And we ended up going all the way, and we ended up with a 4-4 split. And there was a lot of discussion, and there was a lot of fears. There was a lot of confidence. So it's very hard to manage this politically and culturally and legally as you move forward to this. And all the people on this, on our panel have probably been involved in discussions like this. So a lot of that is, very, very difficult to manage. But you want to, try to get as much as you can through negotiation and understanding, because oftentimes we're on the right side of this thing. We're trying to save the state from itself. I appreciate Professor Fletcher bringing that up, because I'm just going to finish on this. When I first got into tribal government, I looked up to the state legislator and the city councils and the county commissioners, and I thought, these guys really got their act together. And then I realized, no, they don't really have much. much together than we do, because we've got certain, and I know no offense, but we've got a certain values, traditions, and resources, and we stay in the same place. That was what Chief Seattle said in his speech. He says, "You people are like birds. You just fly off anywhere you want. You know, we don't want to wander far from the graves of our ancestors." And nothing against people who move around, but I'm just saying that was the understanding. So a lot of tribal leaders are connected to place. So I just like to, and that's one thing that really, I hear about Alaska and what they want to do as far as getting feet of trust. The best thing the state of Alaska could do for their economy is let the tribes have their land. It would just, their economy would just perform so well. So enough of that from me. Thank you.
So thank you, Savannah, for this question. We work with Savannah at TCC. So how do you
Wait, this is a
balance?
planted question? You
So
planted this question?
I didn't
Come
plan.
on, the integrity is lost.
So we have to really be careful on the cases that we bring in Alaska. While we want to just, plug ahead and be like, yes, absolutely, we don't need the state or federal government to recognize our governing powers. We can just do it. Not really, when you don't have funding and when you need, some kind of law enforcement to back up whatever court decree you're doing. So we do have to mind the decisions that we're trying to get enforced. And it is a balance, and we have to take into account where our tribes are on the spectrum of kind of moving towards wellness. In Alaska, we have 230 tribes. These weren't our traditional governments. Our traditional governments were less. We had less than 230. We were, semi-nomadic all around the state. And then when they made our people settle into villages, then the federal government came along and said, "Oh, this village is one government." If we were to create our own tribes, we would have done it differently. We likely would have been bunches of 2 to maybe 10 villages would be one government. And so things would have been a little bit easier to govern because there would have been checks and balances. And I think as we determine how we govern in the future, I think that is a model to go towards. But what I'm trying to say is, while our tribal members and our tribal people are good people, we are also suffering from colonization and oppression. And when we make decisions on tribal protection matters, we have to make sure that they have followed in their own tribal laws. And if our tribes have made those decisions following their tribal laws, I think those will always be good facts that we can bring. But if they haven't, then we need to ask the tribes to go back to their own tribal laws. And if they're not written, they need to go back to their traditional laws, which is those covenants of understandings between human to human. And we've kind of gotten away from that because we're so busy, trying to create this, not a facade, but kind of create this image to the federal and state governments of who we are, when really sometimes the answers don't lie in that. The answers lie in creating the existence of who we are amongst each other. So it's a balance. And in Alaska, it's pretty unique because our tribes are very small and they sometimes don't have those checks and balances within their own systems that we as tribal advocates have to create or assist in creating.
I don't think I have anything to add. I think that pretty much says it all.
Yeah, that was a good summary. So I'm gonna have the last question here, and I'm going to take it from the submissions, and I think it's a good question about how it's somewhat similar to the last question, but how advocates and tribal leaders and all of us have to balance these sort of competing interests of this dynamic we live in and exist in between the federal, state, local, and tribes. The question is, it starts out, sovereignty shouldn't be something that you have to explain, but something that you exercise. So why do tribes approach it as if they're looking for an audience to listen versus just exercising it? And I find this sort of funny as a Mohawk, because often, exercise is the best approach, I think. But I'll turn it to Chairman Forsman about how you interact. How do you do that balance between exercising and explanation and coalition building?
It's a great question. I guess I shouldn't be on this call because I shouldn't even explain it just out exercising it. Not to be no, I understand the question's a good one, and I appreciate it. I think that we are I won't want to say we're identified as, or labeled, or however we want to, Professor Fletcher could help me with this, as a domestic dependent sovereign, and Natasha could as well, in the law. So we have to really work with, I believe we really have to work with local government, with state government, with federal government in explaining our status, because once they understand the status, then we don't have to go to court. So a lot of it will be eliminated. We had a situation here where we were just trying to get the state parks to turn over ownership of a small 1 acre park that encompassed a good portion of our traditional centuries-old winter village, and it was actually named Old Man House Park after the village of Old Man House. And there were people in the community here that live here on the reservation, not tribal, like I said before, it's a checkerboarded reservation, that said that can't happen. We can't let the tribe do that. They're not gonna let us go down there. It's gonna be horrible. And they were knocking on doors, telling people this is a horrible thing that's gonna happen. And one of the people who now works for the tribe after all this saw the paperwork, and then she went to the museum and she talked to the tribe and goes, this is wrong, because once she had all the facts, she realized that this wasn't even true, that all these things are going to happen. So we got to educate people and potential Congress people, potential voters, about our history. Because once they have all that information, they realize that we're not, asking for anything extra special, that we're not an elitist group, that we aren't getting unequal rights. These are legal rights, just like the railroads got legal rights, the mining companies have legal rights. A lot of different people in this country have legal rights that they protect fiercely. We do as well, and that's why we got to get the information out, because it just makes it easier for us to exercise our sovereignty.
So real basic, in Alaska, we have the highest rates of crime in many instances, and we don't have criminal jurisdiction. We depend on the state of Alaska to provide law enforcement, and they often don't have or not willing to fund the necessary law enforcement to do that. So we can't just go out there with, our 30-06 and, try to enforce the law. Some people do and will take matters into their own hands, but that's not pretty. So in all practical sense, we have to go and explain to people, like, there's lawlessness out here because you state and federal governments are giving us no authority to address these high rates of crime. Our tribes want that authority. Our tribes want to have their own police. We want to reduce the crime rates in our communities. We have no authority to do that. So we have to go out and advocate for ourselves. We've been told for decades that not only do tribes not exist, but you have no authority if you do. And this makes, this creates a lot of no good in our communities. It's oppression. And once you give a little morsel of authority to be like, hey, here's a little bit of authority, go fix your problems that colonization has created, our tribes will grab onto that authority and start fixing their problems, because their children are impacted. Our children are growing up in violence, and advocating for the furtherance of tribal sovereignty is going to put an end to that violence. So in Alaska, it's pretty simple. We have to advocate because we're not given that authorities, and it hurts our families.
Yeah, I think what I would say is I always, to my students, people I work with, our mantra is that tribes are timeless entities. What's happening in Alaska now was happening in Michigan in the 50s and 60s and 70s. There was no acknowledgement of tribes. Most of the Michigan tribes are administratively terminated. Relatively few number of Indian people were still living on their lands. They were all scattered to the four winds, to urban Indian communities. And now we have a much more robust expression of tribal governance and sovereignty that 50, 60 years ago, my grandmother's generation could not have imagined. My mother's generation can barely imagine it as young people. And so there is always hope. And part of sovereignty, part of the expression of sovereignty is talking about sovereignty. We'll always talk about sovereignty. And we'll always talk about it in a way that is complicating about what sovereignty is in our Western notions of a hierarchical sovereign entity, and what governments are for. And sometimes that's terrifying to outsiders. And that's something that we need to keep talking about. And I guess I'll just leave it with that.
Thank you. And I want to turn it back over to Austin, but thank Chairman Forsman, Natasha Singh, and Professor Fletcher for joining us and sharing a lot of really valuable insights. And I'll turn it back to Austin. Thank you to ACS as well.
Well, thank you very much, Josh, and thank you to all the panelists. It feels like we're just sort of scratching the surface here, which is demonstrated in part by the number of questions, unfortunately, that we just didn't have time to get to. But that was incredible, and I really appreciate you taking the time. So with that, I hope everyone has a wonderful night, and look for more programming, hopefully on some of the topics that were touched on here and some of those similar issues that affect communities in other non-state territories. ACS DC is currently working on an event about American Samoa, and it is in the planning stages of events for Guam and the U.S. Virgin Islands, whose issues are obviously different, but the through line here is that there are sovereignty issues that affect various communities around the country that don't get raised up and brought to the attention of so many people. And there's a lot of education to be done. So thank you very much again. I really appreciate it. And good night, everyone.